Hello and welcome to I Should Say That Out Loud. I'm your host, Donna Brendel. This is the second episode of 2025 of my project theme for the year. I'm covering the different definitions of project, and this month the definition from the Oxford Dictionary is to estimate or forecast on the basis of trends or data. And I have a lot of books and experts and research to share with you going back to the early 1900s and all the way through to our modern day 2000s, 2025 even. I'm really excited to pull together the origins, I think, of where we are today, how we've gotten to where we are today, and where I think some of these ideas and trends have started. We'll see what you think. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you agree. To let you know a little bit more about myself, I am a late diagnosed woman on the autism spectrum, and I also am dyslexic, and I have OCD and anxiety. So I have a broad range of the comorbidities that can often come with autism. I have a lot to share today, and I'm hoping that you can see the trends in the development over the decades and over the past 115 years, give or take. So I think I'm ready to go through my book analysis and sharing from all these books, which I'm so excited about because I love books so much. I'm sure you're not as excited as I am, but here we go anyway. Well, maybe you are. Let me know if you are as much of a book lover as me, and shout out your appreciation of books and knowledge and information. And like this episode, subscribe to my channel, and share this episode and tell everybody about my thoughts and ideas and about just the fun of sharing books and reading from books. Okay, so here we go. So first I'm going to read from the Montessori Method. This is a biography by Maria Montessori. Anne E. George contributes to this as well. This was written in 1912. She was putting together her methods before then, before the publishing of what she created. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, she was developing her methods. So this is from the introduction to the Montessori Method. I love reading introductions and forwards of books. There's so much good information in them. And this was written by Henry Holmes of Harvard University in February of 1912. This is on page XXI of the introduction, 21. He's sharing Dr. Montessori's ideas on education in this introduction. And she says that education is to guide activity, not repress it. Environment cannot create human power, but only give it scope and material, direct it, or at most, but call it forth. And the teacher's task is first to nourish and assist, to watch, encourage, guide, induce, rather than to interfere, prescribe, or restrict. I really like this because I see a lot of the latter in modern day teaching, the interfering and prescribing and restricting students, rather than allowing them to be nourished and assisted and encouraged and guided in their own discovery process. Next, he says on the same page, the Montessori directress, in quotes, does not teach children in groups, with the practical requirement, no matter how well mediated, in quotes, that each member of the group shall join in the exercise. The Montessori pupil does about as he pleases, so long as he does not do any harm. So, like I said a minute ago, the Montessori method allows children to discover their education at their own pace and in their own way, in the way that works for them, and encourages them to be curious. And then on the next page, on XXII, it says that as to physical education, the two systems, so he's comparing the Montessori method with the Pestalozzi method, They're both from Italy, but he's comparing the two, and he says the two systems agree in much the same way. Both affirm the need for free bodily activity, for rhythmic exercises, and for the development of muscular control. But whereas the kindergarten seeks much of all this through group games with an imaginative or social content, the Montessori scheme places the emphasis on special exercises designed to give formal training in separate physical functions. And the reason I mention this is because when I read from Ido's book, IDO, he talks a lot about physical exercise and how much that has helped him in his therapy and moving forward in wellness. So that's what I wanted to share from the Montessori method. And she was a pioneer in teaching because she did all of these things before the next two experts that I am going to talk about. And these two experts really are the beginning of a shift in trajectory in both doctors and psychologists and parents, I believe. The first is from Jean Piaget, and he is considered the father of developmental psychology. And then after him came Arnold Gesell. This one doesn't have a cover, but he is considered the father of physical developmental milestones. So we have Piaget, who talked about the psychological development of children, specifically in speech. That is a big topic within autism. And then Arnold Gesell, who talked about embryology and physical development and the developmental milestones. So let's get into these two books. So fascinated by these two thought generators. And I think their incredible concepts have been very important to our understanding of human development, both physically and psychologically. But at the same time, I think we as society and culture have taken what they've established and then taken for granted the way infants and children develop because of what these two men said and learned and put out there into science. And it's kind of, I think it's given parents permission to not do what we had been doing before this research and these theories that are so effective to help children develop physically and psychologically. And because they were able to explain it to the world, I think as we as a society began to understand these concepts, we took these concepts as a given that these things happen, development happens in children on its own. Like a child could develop physically and psychologically all by itself without interaction from parents and teachers and the community and so many people that it takes for a child to develop these things that they talk about. And so it kind of gave, I think, parents and caregivers and teachers and adults permission to, just not permission, but I think just the unconscious idea and thought and decision to just take a step back and just let them develop on their own. But also, and I think even worse, even worse, is that because we're so competitive, some parents, I think this is a spectrum here, a spectrum of parents stepping back and letting children develop on their own, which is not possible. They need us to do these things that Piaget and Gesell lay out. But then there's the other end of the spectrum where parents said, okay, so if this is normal development, my child is going to develop earlier and faster and more and smarter and stronger, and better at sports because I'm going to do even more of what these men laid out that helps children develop. I'm going to do more of it and earlier in their childhood and in their development, which does not work for all children, especially children with autism and neurodivergence. It really is harmful and causes trauma. And then when that happens and is undiagnosed and unrecognized, and a child is not given permission to say, this is too much, or does not have the ability to comprehend and or say, this is too much, it causes so much damage. And then parents can either say, I'm sorry I pushed you too hard. Let me step back and give you time to develop at your own rate. Or they can, punish the child and say, why aren't you listening to me? Why aren't you doing these things? Why aren't you doing what your siblings are able to do? Or why aren't you doing what the neighbor's kids are able to do? Or why aren't you doing what the other kids in your class are able to do? And wow, is that harmful? And then when you take your child to the doctor and the doctor says, well, here's this developmental checklist and your child isn't meeting X, Y, and Z. And so something's wrong with your child. And we have to do these therapies and these other tests and figure out what's wrong with them, rather than just giving them more time and recognizing that maybe nothing's wrong. Maybe they just need more time to develop, because this is a guideline. It's not a set in stone certainty that all children will develop at this exact rate or way. And then when you have parents on this spectrum of doing less or more, giving them like free range to develop however they want to develop or however they will develop on their own, or pushing them to develop faster and more rigidly and more than they're able to, then they can handle more than their physiology and more than their sensory system can handle, more than their parasympathetic or more than their sympathetic system can handle. Oh, that causes so much harm. So let's get into what these two men have discovered and laid out for us in the early 1900s. So Jean Piaget first wrote this in French in 1923, and then it was translated into English in 1926, and then, disseminated around the world. So again, I'm still in the introduction to these books. Actually, this one is from the preface. And so this preface is written by I think it's French, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Claparade. And on page 10 to 11, or X to XI, he's talking about previous research and previous theories. And he says, after all, the error has been, if I am not mistaken, that in examining child thought, we have applied to it the mold and pattern of the adult mind. This is a revolutionary idea. People used to look at children as if they already had adult minds, which to us nowadays is like, well, of course they don't. But in the early 1900s, that was a revolutionary idea. He goes on to say, we have considered it from the point of view of the logician, of logic, rather than of the psychologist. This method, excellent perhaps for establishing our first inventory, has yielded all it can yield, and ends only in a blind alley. It enables us to straighten out the skein, but does not teach us how to disentangle the threads. He's talking about the skein of thoughts and how those threads can get tangled up in our minds. And he's talking specifically about children. So he's saying that his research has helped to straighten out the skein of thought in general, but still makes it difficult to disentangle the threads in a specific child's mind. And then he goes on to say that Jean Piaget's studies offer us a completely new version of the child's mind. So again, this was revolutionary back when it was first published. On page XI, Mr. Claparade goes on to say, by a stroke of genius, M. Piaget, so it's M. Jean Piaget, having assimilated these new theories, or rather having extracted the good from each, has made them all converge onto an interpretation of the child's mentality. He has kindled a light which will help to disperse much of the obscurity which formerly baffled the student of child logic. And then on page XIII of the preface, the author of the preface says, if the child mind so often appears opaque to adult observation, it is not so much because there are elements added to or wanting in it, not so much because it is full of holes and excrescences, as because it belongs to a different kind of thought, autistic or symbolic thought, which the adult has long since left behind him or suppressed. So this author seems to be saying that all people have autistic or a symbolic thought as a child, but that is grown out of in the neurotypical population. Very interesting. Autism is not something that can be cured and not something that is grown out of. But autistic thought here seems to be laid out as a process of development that neurotypical children start with and then grow out of as they develop. Very interesting idea. Okay. And then on page XIV, I love this paragraph. This clinical method, therefore, which is also an art, the art of questioning, does not define itself to superficial observations, but aims at capturing what is hidden behind the immediate appearance of things. It analyzes down to its ultimate constituents the least little remark made by the young subjects. It does not give up the struggle when the child gives incomprehensible or contradictory answers, but only follows closer in chase of the ever-receding thought, drives it from cover, pursues and tracks it down till it can seize it, dissect it, and lay bare the secret of its composition. It sounds a lot like a hunt. He's on the hunt for why children think what they think and for what it is that they're thinking and for analyzing the words that they say or the sounds that they say and what the meaning is behind those sounds and words, even if they're undecipherable. And as I got into reading, I did get into the first chapter of this book. He does very meticulously record every single thing that the children he was studying would say, even if it was undecipherable. And he would pay very close attention to what was happening and record what was happening, like if the child was playing as he or she said those things and what they were doing when those things were said. It's a very meticulous study. And I also find it fascinating that he's studying children, very young children, who cannot give consent to participate in research, which now I'm hearing that people are not researching autistic children because they cannot give consent. So there is a shift over the past 100 years in this idea. And where would we be without Jean Piaget's research and findings? Okay. And then the last idea I want to share from this preface of this book is on page XV or 15. The functional question fertilizes the structural question and states the problem better than any other way. It alone gives full significance to the details of mechanism because it sees them in relation to the whole machine. So it may well be because he began with the question. So this preface author is explaining that Jean Piaget began with the question, and here is the question. Why does the child talk? That is a very big and important question. And what are the functions of language? That M. Piaget has been led to such fertile observations and conclusions. So this author is saying that because Piaget asked such a big, important question, why does the child talk and what are the functions of language, that he was able to get to such fertile observations and conclusions. And that is why he became the father of developmental psychology. Fascinating. So that's what I had to say from Piaget's book today. Next, we go to Arnold Gesell, and his book is called The Embryology of Behavior. His book was published in 1945, and his research was conducted in the 1920s. So he and Piaget were conducting their research around the same time, and just after Dr. Montessori published her teaching methods. Arnold Gesell has been named the father of developmental milestones, and these are the physical developmental milestones. I want to read from the preface, and the preface author is Arnold Gesell himself. He studied and worked in the Clinic of Child Development, the School of Medicine, Yale University, New Haven, Connecticut, USA. And on page VII, page 7 of the preface, Arnold Gesell says, The infant comes by his mind, in quotes, in the same way that he comes by his body. That is, through the process of development. This growth process, and then he says in parentheses, the terms growth and development are virtually interchangeable, is in every phase a process of morphogenesis. It creates new forms and configurations in the molecules of living tissue, in the anatomy of the constituent organs, and in the reactions of the total organism. It configures the basic patterns of behavior, which are mediated by the nervous system. So he developed the developmental milestones that we still use today, that our doctors still use today when we bring our children in for their checkups. And I think we've forgotten how important it is to recognize that developmental milestones are an important and strong indication of the development of the nervous system. And I think maybe because we see doctors as such an authority on our children and on our children's development, that we just take what they say for granted and we take it as fact, and we don't know the research behind it and the additional information behind it, and how the systems that went together in creating these developmental milestones, how they work together. And then so much is lost in translation of the development and the dissemination of the developmental milestones that, like I said before, I think we've taken for granted that these things should just happen and children should just develop, and that we lose the important piece of this, that the child's nervous system plays a key role in their physical development. And if we push them before they're ready and stress them out, it can, in my analysis, my non-expert analysis, it can hinder their development and cause harm and trauma emotionally, mentally, and physically. That's what I'm getting from putting all of these ideas and thoughts together. And then on page VII, this is so important. Arnold Gesell says himself, "We do not hope to solve the profound creative mysteries which underlie the growth process, but shall be content to indicate some of the conditions and the mechanisms which give unity and dynamic design to the cycle of behavior growth." Wow, there is so much in that sentence. So he's saying that he's not looking to solve the profound creative mysteries behind the growth process, but instead he is content to indicate some of the conditions and the mechanisms that give unity and dynamic design to the cycle of behavior growth. And we, as people who take our children to the doctor and allow the doctor to go through this checklist and say your child is developing normally or not developing normally, we have not known that these doctors and scientists did not mean or intend for that to be the be-all, end-all guide for all children, that there is a spectrum, a differentiation of rate of growth, and that there are conditions and mechanisms that need to be in place in order for children to grow and develop physically, behaviorally, emotionally, psychologically at these laid out developmental milestones in a general sense. So I believe that science and culture over the following decades, since these two men wrote these profound findings, that we've taken their research and their conclusions as blanket solutions to how children should develop, that we're bringing the idea of a spectrum back. I think we think that that's a new idea. I think the introduction of the concept of developmental milestones took out the spectrum idea and said children should all be the same. And now the autistic community is bringing back the idea of the spectrum and trying to kind of backtrack and undo the damage that equality of development or stagnant rate of development as a model of perfection has done. I hope I am communicating what I'm trying to say. That's Arnold Gesell, the father of developmental milestones. Next, to conclude the trends and data from the 1900s, we're making progress. I want to read from Carl Jung's book, The Undiscovered Self. This was copyrighted in 1957 and 1958. So this came a little bit after Piaget and Gesell. And I just want to read from page 8 because his thoughts on science and the scientific method are very important for what I've already talked about and for the direction that we're going currently in science. Carl Jung says on page 8, and there's no preface or introduction. This is from chapter 1 of The Undiscovered Self. So this is Carl Jung speaking or writing himself. He says on page 8, the statistical method shows the facts in light of the ideal average, but does not give us a picture of their empirical reality. While reflecting an indisputable aspect of reality, it can falsify the actual truth in a most misleading way. This is particularly true of theories which are based on statistics. The distinctive thing about real facts, however, is their individuality. Not to put too fine a point on it, one can say that the real picture consists of nothing but exceptions to the rule. I love that. I, as an autistic person, am all about the exceptions to the rule. And that, in consequence, absolute reality has predominantly the character of irregularity. Oh my gosh, I love that. He's basically saying there's no normal. As much scientific research and statistical data we provide, he's saying the norm is irregularity. You can find an average, but that doesn't mean that most people live in that spot, if that makes sense. And I think that's what I'm trying to say, going back to Piaget and Gesell, is that they put forth these methods and theories based on their research, and maybe not even based on statistics, because they had more theory than statistics, but it still wasn't meant to be the norm, that we as parents should be pushing our children to be following and being in that norm, because the norm is not the norm, is what Jung is trying to say. It's a statistical norm. It's like a middle ground of all of the data put together. And our children fall all through that spectrum. I think whether they're neurotypical or neurodiverse is what we need to start to wrap our brains around and pull back from pushing our children to live up to these scientific and developmental theories that are interesting and important, but not something that we should force our children into, because it's like our children are all different shapes and sizes. And in the analysis of trying to squeeze a square peg into a round hole, and trying to squeeze our children of, all of the different shapes and sizes that they are into one hole of developmental milestones is ridiculous and harmful. Okay, and he goes on to say on the same page 8, these considerations must be borne in mind whenever there is talk of a theory serving as a guide to self-knowledge. There is and can be no self-knowledge based on theoretical assumptions, for the object of self-knowledge is an individual, a child, an adolescent, a young adult, an adult, an individual, a relative exception, and an irregular phenomenon. So, I love that. I'm a phenomenon, and so are you. Hence, it is not the universal and the regular that characterize the individual, but rather the unique. That is something that I hear a lot of autistic podcasters saying, and it's so true. if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Autism presents differently in every autistic person. I think what Jung is trying to say is that human character presents differently in every human. That's the bigger idea. He is not to be understood as a recurrent unit, but as something unique and singular, which in the last analysis can neither be known nor compared with anything else. He's saying that when we try to compare our children to these developmental milestones, we're taking away the uniqueness of our children, the unique way that they are designed, the unique way that they have been brought into the world, the unique way that they've been nurtured, the unique genetics that they have, the unique environment that they have. It's just incomprehensible how unique every person is. Again, I'm going to say whether you're neurotypical or neurodiverse. Okay. At the same time, man, as member of a species, can and must be described as a statistical unit. Otherwise, nothing general could be said about him. Here he's giving the reason why we do research and create theories. I mean, it's important, it's necessary, but we as receivers of the research results have to remember how unique and different we still all are, even though these generalized ideas are put together. For this purpose, he has to be regarded as a comparative unit. The results in a universally valid anthropology or psychology, as the case may be, with an abstract picture of man as an average unit from which all individual features have been removed. So when a study generalizes people, all of the individual features of the different people within that study have been removed. And the lump sum generalized conclusion is what is presented. But that doesn't mean that that conclusion was true for all of the people in the study. It seems simple in the end, but we've come to rely so much on science and experts and doctors that I think we have either forgotten or never been taught this very important information. It goes on to say, if I want to understand an individual human being, I must lay aside all scientific knowledge of the average man and discard all theories in order to adopt a completely new and unprejudiced attitude. Wow. Is that a big sentence? I can only approach the task of understanding with a free and open mind, whereas knowledge of man or insight into human character presupposes all sorts of knowledge about mankind in general. There's the paradox. And I think that's what we struggle with when we read all of this research and we put it all into our database of our minds as parents, as caregivers, as teachers, as professionals, and then we try to force everybody to fit within those learned ideas. And then we forget to remember that each person is very unique and individual. And that's Carl Jung. Thank you, Carl.